Good morning, everyone. That's where we're going for the next 9 Sundays. We've had different series that have just been shorter, but now we're going to be in the book of Daniel. 2,600 years ago, this story, this man lived and his friends. And so we're going to be there for 9 Sundays. It's my joy to take you there and see how relevant, how amazing it is. I want to begin with just how much I love to go to the IMAX theater. Y'all ever been to the IMAX with the big screen and the loud volume? Sometimes we complain about the volume here. You should go to the IMAX and listen to the sound of it there. But basically, when I'm there, they often will start with previews or trailers of movies that are coming. And if there's a famous director, especially, they'll promote him. So like the new Transformers movie that's coming out in June, they'll say from director Michael Bay. And it causes us to think about all the movies that we've seen by him or directed by him. And we begin to wonder what this new movie that he's directed will be like. And I bring that before you because that's the way God does. He directs other lives, and then he calls us to think about those lives. Like he says in the Old Testament, he says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we know that we can go back in history and read about those men and how God directed their lives. And he wants us to. And he wants us to learn. He wants us to see how they related, how he worked in their lives, so that we can begin to wonder and get some idea of how he wants to work in our life. Now, the reason, again, that I say that is because our title for the series, or our approach to the book of Daniel, is simply the God of Daniel. It's a phrase repeated many times in the book itself. But it immediately makes this 2,600-year-old book relevant to us, because when we see God working in Daniel, that's our God. And we can begin to get to know him and realize that even though it was a long time ago and the context is very different, the God is exactly the same. And so he will show you things, I hope, in the next 9 weeks that you'll begin to expect and get excited about happening in your own life, simply because he's the same God. The God of Daniel can be your God and my God. The setting was 606 BC. Again, many years ago. It was not a good time for God's people. God's people at that time was a nation, not a church. And it was the nation of Israel, and they had been unfaithful to God for many, many years. God had sent prophets to warn them to come back and be faithful, even in a general sense, to the law that he had given them. And they refused, and they continued in their rebellion. And so the northern kingdom, which was the 10 tribes, had been carried off by Assyria and never to be heard from again. And now the southern kingdom was facing its darkest hour. The southern kingdom was at the brink of disaster. The last 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, that were hanging on in the south, were just about to be destroyed. And so we read in Daniel chapter 1 in the first 2 verses, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. And these he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put into the treasure house of his God. Now, if you were in that day, this would be like finding out John 3:16 is no longer true. This would be like the most holy, the most secure, reverent aspect of your faith is being wiped out. Jerusalem and even the temple and even the holy vessels have been carried off by a pagan world empire, the empire of Babylon. And so again, can't stress this too much. It was the darkest hour for God's people. They were in shame. They were in judgment. They had failed God, and he had finally brought the Babylonians over the hill to judge them. Just think of the movie Schindler's List, or a movie like that, for what is happening now to God's people. Many of God's people randomly being killed. No government, no police. Complete at the mercy of a cruel pagan world empire. As the book of Daniel opens, it's hard to imagine the things that Daniel and his 3 friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, had witnessed and had experienced in their little young lives. So this siege and this conquering and plundering, again, was a judgment from God because the people were far from him and had resisted his many attempts to warn them. And so now they're judged. And this is where the story begins. Daniel and his 3 friends are stolen away in violence, taken from their families, from their homes, and made to live in the center of this pagan world empire. And they're trained to lead in this new world empire. And we see how they remain faithful to God. So now let's begin to read. Picking up then where we left off in verse 3, and we'll read chapter 1. I want you to follow along with me. Daniel chapter 1 and verse 3. Then the king ordered, this would be King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Babylonian Empire, ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, "I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, so they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. Now, this is just the first of 6 chapters, the first half of the book of Daniel, that are awesome stories you've probably heard in Sunday school or in church, vacation Bible school, if you've grown up in the church. And this first one is truly amazing because they're taken from their families. And obviously these boys were raised in good families, and they're taken away. But we see that whatever their parents did stays with them in a pagan empire, and they stand strong, and God blesses them for it and exalts them even in a pagan setting, in a pagan empire. And this is just setting the story for all the rest that will happen. But this first story is definitely very significant. Now, as we consider them today in this first chapter, I want to say 3 things about Daniel and his friends. First, notice their stronger presence. Their stronger presence. And I'm going to say things particularly to parents today and to youth because they're young. And we see success happening here. And those of us who are parents thinking about our children can measure our parenting by this story. Daniel and his friends were taken from their culture, their country, their families, and they were forced into slave labor far away in the city of Babylon, in the heart of a pagan culture, the current world empire of their day. They were trained in the king's service. They had no physical defects. They were handsome. They were bright. They were well-informed. They were from high-class families. The king would only take the brightest and the best for this kind of a program, sort of an internship program for future advisors, future wise men in his kingdom. And so we know that we would have been very impressed with these guys. If they were here today, you would say, oh my goodness, these are like amazing, handsome, smart, bright, broad-minded, well-educated, these kind of things. And yet we can tell that right away they're not prima donnas. They feared God. They strictly observed his laws. They prayed regularly, and they wouldn't give in. They wouldn't be molded by the pressure of the evil world, the city that was around them. And I just think, first off, I just want to say that's so cool that you can actually be good looking and smart and gifted and not be stuck on yourself. Right? Now, I've never been able to prove that myself, but I'm thankful for when people can prove that in their lives. That they come along and have all those gifts, they know it's from God, and they actually have faith, humility, and stand for something besides, look at me, I'm so great. So this is the way they are, and the training plan we see includes total life training, total life transformation, a new language, a new pagan literature, new diet, and even their names being changed. Now this is a representative sample. We're meant to see the pressure, feel the pressure of this pagan culture coming down on them. Their names even would be changed. Daniel, his name in the second part of it, Daniel, and Hananiah, Mishael and Azariah, those are obviously two of the most common names for the God of Israel, Elohim and Jehovah. So their names were given by godly families that represented the God of Israel. And Nebuchadnezzar immediately is changing their names to Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. All those are after the pagan gods of Babylon, particularly the gods Bel, Aku, and Nebo. And so again, this is Babylon's attempt, and we can imagine there being many other tests for them, and they resisted. Many other pressures would come on them, including the fact that their home and their country was so weak spiritually that it was being judged by God. It's such a dark time that it wasn't Israel at its best, Israel at her worst. And here are these young men standing for those qualities that their people back at home aren't even standing for and being judged as a result. And there they are now living far away from their families, even at a young, tender age, and they're standing strong like olive trees in the desert for their faith. And so this brings up the whole subject again, that they have a stronger presence than the presence of Babylon. And I want you to see this, especially as a parent, but you can also see it in your own life, hopefully. Is the presence of God stronger to you, better to you, than the presence of the evil culture that's all around us? Because the United States is less and less the people of God. It's more and more an unregenerate living like and the culture is very much like an unregenerate government. And we can ask ourselves on any given day, do we like God better than that? Or do we choose God more than we choose the pagan, anti-Christian things that are around us on a daily basis? And then have we transmitted that to our children? The ultimate test of our parenting is not what our children do when they're with us. It's not how nice and compliant and obedient they are while they're growing up in our home. As much as that reflects well on us, the ultimate report card comes when they're in their college dorm or they're in their apartment and they have left home. What do they do then? What do they choose at that point when they are no longer with us? That's the whole purpose that we have been raising them. God has given them to us to thrust them out into the world like an arrow, straight and narrow and with force. And the whole judgment, the whole test is how are they when they leave us and they have pagan culture all around them. When they can walk down their college campus and have every form of evil available to them, what will they choose then? That's the ultimate test. And so as a parent, even with a young child, even with a newborn, or even before they're even born and you're contemplating being a parent, that's how you should start. Start with the end in mind and say, if that's the ultimate test, what do we do? How do we parent so that when they're gone from us, they will choose these values? Obviously, then you have to back up and you have to pray and do what you think will help them make the right choice in that moment. You can't protect them forever. We can't keep them at home. We can't go with them once they've grown up and they go out into their lives. We can't be there with them on their college campus or at their first job. We can't be present with them anymore. So we have to give them this stronger presence that'll stay with them, like it was with these young boys. They were taken away from their homes. The parents were no longer around them, but there was a presence that stayed with them that was better than Babylon. And that's the presence that we have to experience as parents and then transmit and contagiously infect and give to our kids so they have it even after they leave us. Obviously, we have to do more than just give them rules. We have to do more than just teach them or traditions or guilt trips. None of that is going to accomplish that goal. And so there has to be more to it than that. Our kids are already in Babylon. Our kids are already, if they watch TV, if they go to school, even a Christian school, if they're on social media, right? If they go on the internet, then they're already experiencing to some extent Babylon, and what will keep them unique and unspoiled, again, has to be something in their heart and their mind that they say is better. Ultimately, you can't restrict them, and then they just have to choose. And do they choose something? Have we given them something better than Babylon? And that's the lovely presence of our God that is better than anything the world has to offer. I remember when my sister, Sherry, my oldest sister, she's 4 years older than I am. I remember when she was a junior at our Christian school, very much like FCA. It was called Norfolk Christian, and she was chafing at the bit. She was gifted as a musician. She was a cheerleader. She was successful socially in many ways, but she didn't have faith. She didn't have it internally. So to her, the Christian school just seemed like a legalistic, negative system that she wanted to get out of. And she just came to my dad so often and just said, please, even just for my final year, my senior year, would you just please let me go to First Colonial High School, the local public school that was near us in Virginia Beach. And, whatever my parents prohibited, whatever they forbid from her, she just seemed to have all the more desire for it. Back then it was the disco scene, and she would talk about, I can still remember her eyes just lighting up, like she just knew that was so good. And everything that came with it, that was associated with it, wasn't good. But to her, it was awesome. Well, my dad finally gave in and let her go to the public school for her senior year. He was thinking, well, you're only a year away from your freedom anyway. And so I can't keep restricting all this. And as he feared, the greater access to the world only accelerated her wildness. And she began a 5-year period of rebellion and lived exactly the opposite of what she'd observed and seen around her in our family, in our church, in our school. And it was very painful. Painful for her, painful for my parents, painful for all of us. My Uncle Wayne married my mom's sister, is still a college professor in Iowa. I remember him giving the advice because he worked with a lot of college-age students, and he would tell my parents, hey, oftentimes, he said, the kids will come back from the rebellion and land somewhere close to the real values that are there in their parents' lives, their hearts. And so he would encourage that she would, and that's exactly what she did. After 5 years. She married a guy from Eastern North Carolina, a really good country values, but not a Christian. And, you just kind of turn with them and hope and pray for the best. My dad prayed for their salvation at their wedding. And it wasn't more than a year or two into their marriage that Woody came to faith, and Sherry followed right behind him. And they now, almost 40 years later, are still walking with the Lord. In an amazing way. They're very involved in their church, even they're in several small groups. They open their home for ministry. It's a big farm, and have church activities and just things going on all the time. Both their daughters have served the Lord in vocational Christian service. One of them is still serving in vocational Christian service. Both of them have a deep passion in their heart for God on their own. And they love God on their own. People who hear Sherry's story, when she gives her testimony, they can't believe it. They can't imagine her being like she was during that 5-year period. where she had to prove it. And that's how my dad would put it. He just says, some children, they have to prove it with their own painful experience. But I'll tell you, regardless, the wonderful thing is she proved it. When she gave Babylon a try for 5 years, she ultimately realized that God's presence is better and chose it for the vast majority of her life. And I'll tell you, it's so important to have the confidence in that as you raise your children, because the time you're supposed to experience and demonstrate that presence to them is the time when they're most likely not even necessarily realizing it or letting you know that they realize it or encouraging you. You're not even necessarily seeing the result. They're not necessarily entering into that own presence yet, but they are experiencing it through you. Is God's presence better to you than Babylon? Oh, let it be. You will not just be experiencing that. You're conveying that every day at the closest possible range of parenting. And be encouraged, because that goes into their mind and hearts. And even if they have to go out and prove it, they're comparing it always to you. They're comparing what they're experiencing in the world and whatever they have to do or test to what they see and what you've had the chance to demonstrate for them. And it's a very, very powerful thing that can go with them. And I would so encourage that. His presence is so much better. The sons of Korah said in Psalm 84, "How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord Almighty. My soul yearns, even faints, for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh cry out for the living God." And that's in the Bible. That's inspired. That's not just a few religious people. That's true. Even though a whole nation is dark and rebellious and judged by that God, it's still true for those who would be open in their hearts and could experience it. Daniel shines against the black backdrop of his culture and his country. It's still true that God's presence is so much better, and it causes a soul to yearn and cry out and be passionate. And that same psalm ends, "Better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than dwell in the tents of the wicked." Now, Daniel and his 3 friends had that psalm on their favorite playlist on their phone. They were listening to that psalm. They were singing it in their heart, remembering Israel even at her worst. They were still getting excited about what Israel represented. Though so many were faithless and judged and dark and experiencing the consequences and proving it in the most painful way, they themselves were rejoicing in a better presence, better than dwelling in the tents of the wicked, and that's what we see. That's why they stood strong even when they had the best of Babylon all around them. The Babylonians could take these boys out of Israel, but they couldn't take Israel out of these boys. To them, Israel and God was far better than Babylon and its gods, even when Israel was going through the worst of her history. And for us today, through the Holy Spirit, we can have the best experience of this presence. Oh, Lord, thank you so much through Christ. Even the best of Israel, when the temple was filled with the Shekinah glory, they were just doorkeepers compared to us. We walk right into the Holy of Holies thanks to Jesus Christ. And we can experience what they're talking about that is so much better than the world. All the more thanks to the new covenant, Jesus writing this on our hearts, not on tablets of stone, not some place you can't go that's scary, but the veil is torn and we can go right in. And so those of us who know this, who believe this, you can experience and you can offer and convey this to others. You don't just experience it, you bring that sense all around you. And parents, that's what you need to give your kids. A stronger, better presence than Babylon. Not just rules and restrictions, because that's the only thing that's going to stay with them when they're away from you and they have every opportunity. At that moment, even if they have to try it out and prove it in some painful ways, will they ultimately choose what you had over Babylon? That's the test. That's the report card. Now, it's not just through us, it's through our church. It's through other believers that they can experience this better presence, and that's why we at Fairfield place such an emphasis on our children's ministry and our youth ministry, because we need help, we need affirmation, we need people to come along and give them this experience as well. I'll never forget in our church in Houston where I was a youth pastor after I got out of seminary, and The elder of youth that I immediately met and became just such a close friend with, his name was Bruce Irwin. He had a son named Kevin that was a senior in high school when I started there, and he was one of my best leaders. And Bruce sat me down and shared with me, he said, a couple years ago, Kevin didn't even want to go to church or youth group. And so we had a talk. And this is how, and a lot of parents take this differently, but this was his experience and his conviction. He said, I told Kevin, I said, hey, this isn't about you. This is about me and God. He said, let me tell you about Eli the priest in 1 Samuel 3. Because his sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were rebellious, and Eli was judged for not restraining them. God came to Eli and judged him because he failed to restrain his sons. Because I don't understand what all that means, but I'm going to tell you, this isn't about you, Kevin. This is about me and God. So I can't choose it for you. He said, but I'm responsible that you do go. And he said, I don't know what you're going to do when it comes to you in the Spirit, but you will be in the realm of the Spirit. You're going to be where the Spirit's working. You have no choice. You are going to youth group. And he's telling me this story after this guy, Kevin, now has already gone through all that, and now I'm there. He's my best leader. And so obviously through the mission trips and the camp retreats and the regular times every week of teaching and experiencing God and all that, he obviously got it, even before I came, and was one of my best leaders. But you can see that as parents, this is what we've got to do. What can I choose for my child? Well, I have the authority over them. Isn't just to prohibit or make them conform to something while they're with me to make me look good. Ultimately, it's got to be to give them this presence, to what will put their life in the best position to experience the Spirit that's going to be stronger and better than their Babylon. So that's the first point. The longest one we'll do today is simply they had a stronger presence and they stood for it, even in the best of Babylon. The second thing that we see is notice their revealing choice. You follow this story and you see a very revealing choice. They refuse to eat the king's food. Now, I don't like this part of the story because I can't stand vegetables. And I'm thinking, what was the deal with the vegetables? Is this the way this is going? Are we going to all be vegan? I hope not, because I wouldn't preach that sermon, that's for sure. They refused to eat the king's choice food. And we might wonder, why was the Babylonian food such a big deal for these young boys? And of course, back then, the law was the way that you measured your respect or your fear of God. It was the barometer that showed or revealed how much you love God. And the law included, their law at that time included many dietary restrictions that are no longer applicable to us today. So it wasn't that they were legalistic or nutrition enthusiasts. Their diet was a barometer that measured and revealed how big God was for them, and that makes us a very revealing choice. And of course, it's only representative of many other choices that we know they would have had to make. Like, for instance, very beautiful women would have been all around them and extremely attracted to them, and it would have been the hardest time in their life to turn that away and be abstinent, but they were. We can assume that. If they wouldn't eat the king's choice food, then they're making a lot of other choices that are even harder to make, or even bigger in the law itself, even more serious in the law itself. We can assume their abstinence and their choices that would remain faithful. So they took the law seriously because they took God seriously. Now I want to tie in two verses so you'll see this. This is what's so cool because this is true in our lives as well. Verse 8 with verse 17. Verse 8 says, "But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine." Verse 17 says, "To these four young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds," which these things will lead to amazing places in the stories to come. And so I want you to see in verse 8, Daniel honored God. In verse 17, God honored Daniel. In verse 8, God was big to Daniel in his mind and his heart as he approached his choices in his private life in Babylon. In verse 17, God was huge, not just in Daniel's mind and his heart, but in Daniel's life. God showed up and made him and made his friends better, stronger, wiser, not just than their fellow trainees, but all the wise men, the conjurers, the advisors of the king who'd been serving him for many years. They made a choice that honored God. God blessed them. Don't miss the connection. It was a revealing choice that God blessed. God was huge to them in their hearts, and then he's huge to them in their lives as well. And I'll just say this, actually, God is big either way. No matter what we do, our view just determines how our lives are positioned when it comes to his great size. So think of him as a giant ocean liner. When I first read this story, this is just how I pictured God as like this big, huge ship, this cruise ship. And Daniel and his friends they get that that's true of God, so they position themselves to be on the deck with the breeze blowing as they're sailing through life on God and with God. And then everybody else, their fellow countrymen who are being judged and led away into captivity, even some of them destroyed, never to be heard from again. They're like just in a little dinghy, a little small rowboat, and one day they look up and they crash into God. Either way, it's the same thing. God is big. You either know that and you position yourself to be blessed by that hugeness, or you look up one day and you crash into it. God is big. He is big either way. And for them, this was their revealing choice. They got that, and they were blessed by him. So I would ask you today, which is it for you? How are you positioned when it comes to God in your life? Are you more on the judgment side? I don't get it until I wake up and my life is just smashed. Or are you making choices? And if so, what choice are you making? It may seem like a small thing, like to someone else, why do you even do that? And yet to you, you make that choice because you fear God. You make that choice because you know God's big and he's the key to your life. What revealing choice is there? Have you made one? Well, God may lead you. He would lead you to do something that you alone will do, because that's how you respect God. And he can give you that kind of faith. He can do that for you just like he did for Daniel, because the God of Daniel is the God who is the same God today, and he leads us in a very similar way. But just remember, these choices we make, they don't come from discipline. They come from passion. Purity comes from passion, right? Purity comes because we love something else more, not just because we discipline ourselves to not do something that is wrong. It wasn't stoicism that kept these young boys from the king's choice food and the best of the Babylonian Empire that was around them. It was their love for God. We'll never say no to Babylon until we say yes, oh yes, to God. Until you love God, and experience him. Don't think about all the do's and don'ts, and that'll just seem legalistic to you. But then when you experience God, then you'll realize that choice comes from passion, not discipline. Passion. That's how that you'll say no, is because that is how you're saying yes to something that's so much more wonderful. So we see their stronger presence and their revealing choice, and then finally, here at the end, we see their thriving faith. Their thriving faith. My son Rick and I were studying this together when I put the series together 2 years ago. And we were having fun with it every week. And then this was one of his observations that he made. And I said, I'm going to give you credit one time, and then every other thing you say, I'm going to just act like I thought of it in front of people. But basically, he made this point. He said, isn't it amazing the book of Daniel begins where faith ends for most people? The book of Daniel begins with all of its exciting stories and hopeful future prophecies, where faith ends for most people, and that is darkness, adversity. If anything remotely like the adversity that begins the book of Daniel happens in our lives, we're usually ready to quit, or a lot of people are ready to quit. When circumstances in life disappoint us, we go through pain and suffering. Life disappoints us and seems deeply unfair. Many times we'll say, well, I've just had it with God. What good is he doing me? And yet this is exactly where, think of how much more Daniel and his friends could say that with all they witnessed and with all they experienced. And they didn't spend any time whining. They didn't spend any time, whoa, poor is me. Why would I follow God? All his stuff's destroyed. Those tapes that so easily play in our minds, somehow they didn't play in their minds, or they got over them. And they were still able to discover the beginning, not the end, the beginning of amazing miracles in their lives. And amazing stories we still celebrate today. And then some of the most hopeful future prophecies given in the entire scripture. Next to the book of Revelation, it's got the most information, as we'll see in the second half of the book, about what God's going to do in the future. And all that started in the place where most people stop. And I'm just telling you, if you're experiencing adversity in whatever, little ways, bigger ways, even if it's almost as bad as Daniel and his friends, it is the beginning, not the end. Faith thrives. The faith God wants to give you with all the miracles that come with it thrives in the soil of adversity. The olive tree in the desert. That's what these guys, and that's what this story is, an amazing oasis in the middle of deadness, in the middle of, not only in their pagan culture, but in the time and the people of God that's so dark. They shine so bright. Everything else so depressing about God's people at this time, and that didn't stop them. They're like, even if all this around me, I'm not going to experience like failure and the judgment that comes with it. I'm going to experience faithfulness and the blessing that comes with it, and they just go for it. Those four guys show us that no matter what's going on around us, we can always start and be blessed in amazing ways. We can have something happen that's worth writing a book about, even a book that's put in the Bible, with all of the miracles that are coming. Remember now, they had witnessed unspeakable violence and brutality. Jerusalem was conquered. The temple was ransacked. The holy vessels were stolen. They were in the treasuries of the pagan empire. Daniel and his friends were taken. They were enslaved, away from home, away from all support in Babylon, slaves in a foreign land, every excuse to pack it in. And that's just the beginning of their thriving faith. And we see this in the story where Daniel is willing to subject everything to a tangible test. He's willing to say, look, okay, bodyguard, okay, this man who's in charge of our development, we can't eat this food, and I know you're afraid for your life, but I'll tell you what, just give us 10 days and see how we look compared to all the other trainees, all the other interns, and you tell us what you think. And he's trusting that God will show up in 10 days. He's got it, that God is with them, and that God will show up, and he could pray and say, right now, Lord, in my life right now, would you show up and make a difference? That's tangible faith. That's thriving faith in God does show up, and they look better than all the others. And they're allowed to continue their diet and their fear of God. That comes down to even what they eat. And so we see their thriving faith and the miracles that come with it, because it's moment by moment, it's every day. God, right now, I know you're here. You're ready to bless me, not judge me. We're not in the dark. We're in the light here. Watch this. We're God's people. We can still get back through all that to the real truth that's life-changing. And now show up for us, God, right here in these horrible circumstances, slaves in a foreign land. All of our people judge, but you will show up and you'll do miracles. And we'll get a book in the Bible that even during this dark time that's exciting and inspiring for people to read. And they'll name our kids after us. And Daniel's thriving faith, boy, it just shone in the midst of the desert and the barrenness. Faith opens the door for God to work and for us to change, and it can thrive in adversity, so adversity is okay. And it's not the end, it's the beginning. Well, that's it. The stronger presence, the revealing choice, and then the thriving faith. And as we go now to worship, I'll just tell you, don't be intimidated by that. Don't put Daniel on a pedestal. Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. Because 99.9% of faith is a gift from God. 0.1% is a choice on our part. And I would challenge you like crazy, just let God give it to you. I don't care what your circumstances are. I don't care what's been going on. Maybe it's even in your own life. There's been so much faithlessness and judgment. It doesn't have to mean that the rest of your life would be that way. Right there in the darkness and in the desert, you could open your heart and just say, God, give me the faith of Daniel. Be the God of Daniel to me, where you could put my name next to you, and you could use me on your resume, God. I want the miracles to come in my life, and I want your blessing, your touch in the moment by moment test of my life. Open your heart today. He's already doing 99.9% of that, knocking on the door open the door, and he'll give you that. And but now we're going to worship him and pray that he'll do that. Let's bow our heads. Father, we acknowledge you this morning as the God over thousands of years of history, and your miracles and your work and your people and your kingdom is so much bigger even than today in 2017. We thank you that you can work in the Gentile kingdoms just like the United States and like we are, that we can take heart that your work could happen not just in Israel but all over the world. And Lord, we want to be like these 4 young men, and we want to have our children pick that up, and we want to have such a strong experience that it gets in them and it's strong in them when they leave us. Lord, show us the things you want us to choose that may seem little, but they are our way of respecting you, for you are so big. I pray that you would continue to minister to us and just carry us along by your Spirit as we learn from this book in the weeks to come. Bless us now as we worship you, the God of Daniel, the God who's been worshiped by your people for thousands and thousands of years. We gladly join them today, worshiping you as the difference maker in our life. Lord, we praise you and we worship you now in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.